The Russian Revolution was one of the most important turning points for the socialist movement worldwide. And in this video, we are going to examine some of its consequences for the socialist parties that developed in Latin America in the early 20th century. In the immediate term, the Russian Revolution triggers a global wave of revolutionary uprisings throughout much of the world. The uprisings in Europe are by far the most famous today, but this wave eventually spreads to parts of Asia, South Africa, and the Americas, including the 3 South American countries that I have been focusing on in the last several videos. The leftist uprisings in South America do not get very far, and they take the form of mostly general strikes and mass protests rather than revolutions or insurrections. But these uprisings do allow socialists in these countries to feel like they are taking part in a grand historic turning point that is finally going to bring down the capitalist system. This revolutionary wave is a largely unifying experience for the Latin American left that brings together revolutionary socialists, reformist socialists, anarchists, syndicalists, and even left-wing activists from traditional parties like the Chilean Radical Party. But the revolutionary wave plays out very differently in Europe, and the German Revolution in particular creates a deep wedge between revolutionary socialists and reformist social democrats. The failure of the Spartacist uprising in Germany and the perceived betrayal of the German Revolution by the social democratic leadership leads to a permanent breach between communism and reformist socialism in Europe. In March 1919, the Third International, or Comintern, is founded with the explicit goal of uniting left-wing socialist parties behind the communist banner while excluding reformist parties like the German Social Democrats. While the Third International's founding Congress is sparsely attended, its Second World Congress the following year is a much larger affair that includes delegates from socialist parties from across much of Europe, along with Asian countries like Indonesia, Korea, and India. It is at this Second World Congress that Lenin issues the 21 conditions that a socialist party would have to satisfy in order to become a member of the Third International. Together, these conditions would require left-wing socialist parties to undergo major changes in their structure, leadership composition, membership composition, and strategy. A member party would have to remove reformists from its party leadership and labor wing and abandon reformist politics altogether. It would also have to adopt democratic centralism, which means that decisions arrived at by the majority of the party members would be binding upon the minority that opposed them, and the lower bodies of the party will be subordinated to the higher bodies. The party would also have to undergo regular purges of its membership base in order to remove middle-class elements from its ranks. It would have to abandon its social democratic program and get its new program approved by the Third International. And the Third International would also have some say in how the party would conduct its affairs going forward. The party would have to change its name to the Communist Party, and finally, anyone who refused to accept these 21 conditions would have to be expelled from the party. In summary, some of these conditions are requiring the party to get rid of any leader or member who adheres to the wrong type of socialism or who has the wrong class background, while other conditions entail a drastic reduction in the party's autonomy. These conditions end up being a major sticking point for the already well-established European socialist parties that had considered joining the Third International. The conditions are rejected by a majority of members of the socialist parties in France and Spain, leading a communist minority to break away from these parties. The German USPD and the Italian Socialist Party are more divided on the issue of whether to accept these conditions, and both parties ultimately break apart over this disagreement. However, the call to join the Third International also applies to socialist parties outside of Europe. And this means that the three main Latin American socialist parties now need to decide whether to accept these conditions. Upon learning of the 21 conditions, the leaders of the South American parties, Juan de Justo, Emilio Frugoni, and Luis Emilio Recabarren, all share similar reservations. They recognize that their parties are already highly pluralistic organizations with many middle-class members, and implementing the 21 conditions would require them to expel a large share of their membership. Moreover, Justo and Frugoni are precisely the sort of bourgeois reformist leaders who would have to be expelled from the party if the 21 conditions were implemented. Juan de Justo has the easiest time convincing his party to reject membership in the Third International. The Argentine party's communist faction had already broken away from the Socialist Party back in 1918. So the people who are left in the Socialist Party by 1920 are mostly reformists who see no reason why the most successful Socialist Party in the Western Hemisphere needs some guys from Russia to tell them how to run their party. The Argentine Socialist entry into the Third International is never a serious question. The Uruguayan socialist leader Emilio Frugoni faces a much tougher battle because a majority of the members of his party are actually in favor of joining the Third International. Frugoni's opposition to the 21 conditions ultimately leads to his expulsion from the party that he had helped found a decade earlier. An important factor that undermines Frugoni's position is the timing of the Uruguayan Socialist Party's decision. The Russian communists had issued the call for the Second World Congress in mid-June 1920, and the Congress was held from late July to early August. There was no way that delegates from the Uruguayan Socialist Party could get to Moscow in time. In fact, no South American Socialist Party was represented at the Second World Congress. But the Uruguayan Socialists do know that this World Congress is happening, and they know that the Third International is about to invite socialist parties from throughout the world to join. It just so happens that the Uruguayan Socialist Party's ordinary Congress was already scheduled for the following September. Most of the Uruguayan socialists in attendance are thrilled to hear that there is now going to be a Third International, and they vote overwhelmingly for the Socialist Party of Uruguay to join as soon as possible. However, it does not appear that anybody in the party was aware of the 21 conditions when the ordinary Congress took place. News of the 21 conditions does not arrive to Montevideo until either late September or early October, and the conditions themselves are not distributed to party members until October 8th, a whole month after the ordinary Congress voted to join. And so the Uruguayan Socialist Party now finds itself in the awkward position of having already agreed to join this organization without fully understanding the price of admission. Frugoni implores his party to revisit its membership decision. He argues first that complying with the 21 conditions would undermine everything that the party was trying to do, and second, that the party should not be expected to uphold a decision it had made without having complete knowledge of what joining the Third International would mean. But Frugoni is opposed by two other very powerful leaders of the party, Eugenio Gomez, who leads the most important socialist labor union, the FOAM, and Celestino Mibelli, who serves as a socialist representative in Congress alongside Frugoni. Both Gomez and Mibelli favored joining the Third International on ideological grounds, and they also see this as an opportunity to push the more moderate Frugoni out of the party leadership. The Socialist Party holds an extraordinary Congress in early 1921, and this Congress overwhelmingly rebukes Frugoni. In a vote of 1,007 to 110, the party Congress votes to uphold its earlier decision to join the Third International, and the Socialist Party changes its name to the Communist Party of Uruguay, and it expels Frugoni and other reformist leaders from the party. However, there is still the issue of what to do about Frugoni's seat in the Congress. Under the original Socialist Party's rules, seats in Congress belong to the party rather than to the individual. And socialist elected officials were required to draft letters of resignation upon taking office, which will be kept by the party leadership just in case the party ever wanted to replace them with somebody else. Because Eugenio Gomez is now the party leader, he is in possession of Frugoni's letter of resignation. Gomez gives this letter to Mibelli, who presents it to the Uruguayan Congress on Frugoni's behalf. This causes a huge scandal because Frugoni is beloved by many of the more reformist congressmen from the Colorado and Blanco parties, and the National Congress initially refuses to accept this letter of resignation. But after a brief standoff, Frugoni ultimately gives in and he resigns from the Congress. He then joins together with other reformist socialists and he refounds a new socialist party later that year. Meanwhile, Eugenio Gomez consolidates his control over the Communist Party over the course of the 1920s, and in the process, he purges most of his potential rivals from the party, including Celestino Mibelli. By the 1930s, both the Communist Party and the New Socialist Party are under the tight control of Gomez and Frugoni, respectively, and both of these parties are just a shadow of what the earlier Socialist Party had been in the late 1910s. Frugoni's party never wins more than 5% of the vote in any national election, while Gomez's party does not pass the 5% threshold until the 1960s, after Gomez has already been overthrown from the party leadership. The leader of Chile's Socialist Workers' Party, Luis Emilio Recabarren, shares many of Frugoni's reservations about the Third International, but he is ultimately able to avoid Frugoni's fate. Recabarren had been in prison at the time when his party was debating its membership in the International, and although he had expressed his reservations to some of his friends, his opposition to the Third International was never on the public record. By the time that Recabarren gets released from prison, he realizes that his party's entry into the Comintern is too far along to stop, and he pragmatically agrees to go along with this decision, and as a result, he is able to maintain his leadership position in the party throughout the early 1920s. The Chilean Socialist Workers' Party changes its name to the Communist Party of Chile in 1922, but it neglects to implement the rest of the 21 conditions during Recabarren's lifetime. The Chilean Communist Party remains the same decentralized, participatory, and ideologically diverse party that it had been back in the 1910s, and it continues to organize on the basis of autonomous local assemblies rather than democratic centralism. The Chilean Communist Party is still at the height of its power in the labor movement in the early 1920s, and it continues to grow its membership base through 1924 as it begins to expand its reach into rural areas for the first time in its history. However, the Communist Party of Chile's growth comes to a sudden halt in late 1924 when the party leader Recabarren commits suicide, and the Communist Party comes very close to collapsing during the years following Recabarren's death. In the mid-1920s, the Third International, or Comintern, becomes much more firm-handed with unreformed member parties like the Chilean Communist Party. And it dispatches a series of Argentine communist commissioners to Chile in order to bring the party in line with the 21 conditions and force the party to undergo the process of Bolshevization. The Communist Party of Recabarren was still a largely decentralized party in which local sections still had a lot of autonomy, and the national leadership was largely subordinate to the sections in practice. Bolshevization entails creating a much more centralized structure where the local committees would now be fully subordinate to a strong central committee, which in turn would be subject to the instructions from the Comintern. Bolshevization also implies a different model of party membership. The main spaces of member participation would now be local cells based on a member's place of work, and members would face expulsion from the party if they failed to comply with the directives of the party leadership. These reforms are resisted by most of the party's municipal sections, which had grown accustomed to their relative autonomy from the party leadership. And this leads to a lengthy battle between the Central Committee and the sections that culminates in the dissolution of several sections and the exodus of much of the party's membership. At the same time, when all of this is going on, the party finds itself under attack from the right. The military had seized power in Chile through a coup shortly before Recabarren's suicide, and the new military dictator Carlos Ibáñez sets out to destroy the Communist Party and its affiliated labor federation, the FOCH. This repression complicates the Bolshevization of the Communist Party because at the precise moment when the Central Committee seems to be winning its battle against the sections, the National Party leadership gets completely decapitated when the military regime captures every member of the Central Committee. A new Central Committee is formed under the leadership of the Santiago section leader Manuel Hidalgo, but Hidalgo's leadership is rejected by the Comintern. Hidalgo had openly opposed the Bolshevization of the party in the mid-1920s, but the thing that makes him truly unacceptable in the eyes of the Comintern is the fact that Hidalgo is suspected of being a supporter of Leon Trotsky, who has just been expelled from the Soviet Union. The Comintern is not willing to let a suspected Trotskyist lead a major South American Communist Party. And so the Comintern stages a sort of coup within the party in an attempt to install the communist labor leader Elias Laferte as the new party leader. This causes the Communist Party to split apart into two separate organizations. A Stalinist party that is led by Laferte and is officially sanctioned by the Comintern, and a dissident party led by Hidalgo that becomes openly Trotskyist by the early 1930s. By the time that the military dictator Carlos Ibáñez is finally overthrown in 1931, the Communist Party of Chile is an absolute mess. Between the Bolshevization and the military government's repression, the Communist Party has lost over 90% of the members that it had at the time of Recabarren's death in 1924. The party's labor federation, the FOCH, has been completely crushed by the military dictatorship, and the Communist Party itself now finds itself divided into separate Stalinist and Trotskyist organizations. As the 1920s draw to a close, the socialist movements of the southern cone of South America are all deeply divided into rival party organizations. Only the Socialist Party of Argentina has experienced any significant electoral success, and even the Argentine socialists are about to fall into sharp decline starting in the mid-1930s. This is obviously not the end for Latin American socialism. Many of these parties are going to rebuild themselves over the following decades, and in the meantime, new communist and socialist parties will continue to emerge in other parts of the region by the 1930s. In many ways, this second generation of Latin American socialist parties will be better grounded and more self-confident than the early parties of the Southern Cone. One of the Russian Revolution's most enduring legacies for Latin American socialism is that it discredits the idea that revolution is only possible in a highly urbanized and industrial society. If a socialist revolution could succeed in Russia of all places, then perhaps a revolution is also viable in countries like Chile, Peru, and El Salvador as well. By the 1930s, Latin American Marxists will start to come around to the idea that indigenous peasants might be a revolutionary force worth organizing and mobilizing. Compared to the first generation of socialist parties that emerged in Argentina, Uruguay, and Chile, the second generation of Latin American socialist parties will be less wedded to the European model of socialism. Marxist theorists like the Peruvian socialist José Carlos Mariátegui will work to develop a Latin American theory of socialism that is grounded in the region's own history and social realities. And indigenous peoples are going to play a much more central role in Latin American socialist theory and strategy by the mid-20th century.